Hello and welcome to Mittersill. This is Bernie. If you're wondering what these are, they're my headphones, but there's also a microphone on the lead so you can hopefully hear me a little bit more clearly. Today's story is about Alexander Aird, our great-grandfather, and his family and his enterprise on the continent. We were actually blessed as a family with all the information that was passed down to us. Initially, our main contact in the Aird family, that is to say Florence Aird, one of 13 children of Alexander Aird, she put together a chronicle of the family and gave that to my dad. And of course, since my dad has passed away, we have it in our hands now. But there's been lots of information coming from other relations. Erica Morgan in England, whose mother was Anna Aird initially before she got married and then became Anna Sen. Erica had photos and letters and picture frames and so on in her possession, which bit by bit she passed on to my sister Maria in England. We had the Master Builder's book, and then we had that lovely surprise when Laura Hone published the Charles Aird Diaries about 10 years ago. That was a minefield of information as well. Although in the books very little is said about our great-grandfather Alexander Aird, other than he was farmed off to a fruit farm and that he was a spendthrift. About 12 years ago, actually in 2002, when I left England to come to Austria to take up a new post in the travel industry, I became greatly interested in our family story. I was intrigued. I was determined to find out that our great-grandfather wasn't just a spendthrift and wasn't just somebody who was farmed off to a fruit farm in Germany. So with the books, with the information that Florence Keith Aird left us in the family, with things that our parents or my dad had spoken to us about when we were younger, I suddenly began to realize that Alexander was in such a prime position in Germany, and that Austria, being the neighbouring country, was in the middle of the playing field of the John Aird and Son enterprises. So I felt very, very attached to how it must have been in the 1800s in many ways, in terms of the reach. Germany was way behind England in those days, in 1860 or 1856, as far as water and gas and WC facilities were concerned. It was a long way behind. Sewage systems. Germany had a lot to learn from England, and of course John Aird and Son in 1856 was very aware of the potential in Europe, and particularly in Germany. And he sent his son Alexander out to the continent. And Alexander must have gone with great gusto. At 20 years of age, he got married in London. And according to the books, to the Charles Aird books, it took most people by surprise. They weren't expecting him to get married. And he married Janet Keith in Southwark, in London. And his father had formed a company, a little enterprise between him and his son Alexander, and it was called J&A Aird, and they were both 50% shareholders of the business. So out went Alexander at 20 years of age, and his first destination was Copenhagen, where John Aird and Sons were building the gasworks and the waterworks. And he was there with his wife Janet Keith for a couple of years at least. Their first two children arrived when they were working there. Agnes was the firstborn, and then Alexander. That was in 1856, pretty much as soon as he arrived on the continent. And then Alexander branched out and opened an office, or perhaps his father opened the office for him in Berlin, where the J&A enterprise was actually based, and where Alexander and the family largely lived. I say largely lived because there was a lot of toing and froing. Alexander was prone to come back to England for one reason or another. Sometimes he brought delegates out to England to show them how the reservoir system on the Thames embankment worked, or how a particular sewage system worked in one or other parts of the country in the UK. He would bring delegates over, sometimes mayors, certainly engineers, over from Germany, from France and Switzerland, and show them how the John Aird and Son projects functioned, and try to encourage them, of course, to do the same in their respective countries, and therefore employ John Aird and Sons to build the sewers, the gasworks, to lay the water mains, etc., etc. But he also brought his family over, for example, in 1870, when the Napoleonic Wars were threatening parts of the German states, Prussia, for example, because in those days it wasn't Germany, it was Prussia, it was Bavaria, it was various other states that were all actually separate and determined their own future. And so in 1870 he sent his family back to the UK. He wanted to keep them out of danger. So in 1870 they would have been in Berlin. So he moved his family. His then family was probably, I don't know, 7 or 8 children. He had a total of 13 in the end. He remained behind for business reasons, but his family he sent, according to the Florence Keith Aird notes, he sent them to Dunoon in Scotland, where John the Elder and Agnes Bennet very often spent their holidays. So he sent them to a holiday area, and I'm sure they moved down to London as well during that time. And several months later, when the war was when the war was over, the Napoleonic War, the children would return to Germany. So there was a lot of movement. You know, Alexander naturally was born in London, and he would occasionally head back to London, sometimes by appointment, meetings with his father and his brother John and the rest of the family, and sometimes, according to the book at least, he made unexpected visits to England without any notification, which caused a bit of concern in the family, I think, at the time. I've often wondered exactly where their offices were in Berlin and how they looked, and they had warehouses in Berlin. And at one stage, they may have even been selling bathroom suites, sinks, water closets, etc., etc. So the story was there to be found out, and I found a lot of information out from diaries from Florence. I found a lot of information out from diaries of Conrad Keith Aird. Conrad was one of the sons that actually stayed close to his father and was also very experienced, was eventually an engineer himself in the civil engineering field, and initially he was involved in testing water and testing water quality and testing plumbing systems and buildings in Germany, in Breslau, in Berlin and various other cities. The thing that comes to mind when I think of Conrad is that he was born in Brunswick, and this was soon after the family left Copenhagen to move to Berlin. They were given an order from by royal appointment in Brunswick, and obviously in those days, with the separate states, the firm John Aird and Sons, and certainly my great-grandfather Alexander, probably had very good relations with the member of the royal family in that part of the world at that time. and he was able to live in Schloss Richmond, Richmond Palace, which sounds like it's in London, but it was in Brunswick. He was able to live there during the time when they built the water towers, and they may have built other things as well, sewage systems at the same time. We have a couple of photos in our family collection of the water towers, and Conrad Keith Aird was actually born in Richmond Palace, and this is kind of the way it happened with Alexander and his 13 children. Wherever the building project was, there would be an extended stay there quite often, and it wasn't unusual for children to be born also in those places. The two that stick to mind is Brunswick, where Conrad was born, and the next one concerns my grandfather, Valdemar Keith Aird, who was born in a hotel, a kurhaus, some place that you would go to for relaxation, so maybe steam baths and massage, and generally to recuperate. And Valdemar Keith Aird, our grandfather, was born in a kurhaus Schmuck, in a lovely little area near Bad Kreuznach in Germany called Münster am Stein. And of course I've been there, but unfortunately Gasthaus Schmuck or Hotel Schmuck is no longer there. So I believe at the time J&A Aird were working on a project somewhere near Frankfurt, somewhere not too far from Münster am Stein, so he decided to move his wife and his family into the hotel. I mean, it would have cost an arm and a leg, or maybe they did some deals with these properties, or the people that perhaps gave them the order, gave them the contract to build a sewage system or lay mains, may well have assisted them in their accommodation costs in that respect. I've no idea. But so my grandfather was born in a hotel, kurhaus, in a wellness area, and those were the two examples. Alexander was constantly on the move. In the early period that he was in Copenhagen for, and then Berlin, I imagined him traveling by horse and cart, horse carriage, because I don't think at that time there were the trains in progress. They came a few years later. So I imagined him crisscrossing Germany from potential contract to definite contract, and then visiting the family again, and then zooming off again to do something else. The communications would have all been by letter writing and personal visits with people. In later years, perhaps telegram. So he had the whole of the German states as his domain. And at that time, of course, and for the period of the John Aird business concern, right up to the year of 1911, they had a fantastic reputation. And Alexander, my great-grandfather, made the right move at the right time, and was able to get the cooperation from towns and councils and mayors from cities all across what is now known as Germany. And one of his biggest projects was actually in the city of Gdansk, where Alexander Aird almost single-handedly, with a labour force no doubt, made the canalization project for the city of Gdansk, introduced proper sewage systems, water mains, gas mains, and the like. And he was very, very renowned in the city of Gdansk at that time in Prussia. They held him in high regard. I don't actually know whether it was his own project with his own labour force, or whether he involved the British-based John Aird and Sons, or John Aird and Co, as it may have been, or Lucas and Aird at that time. That particular project in Gdansk started in about 1875 or 6, and went up until about the year 1883, when the business J&A Aird, by that time it was A. Aird, it no longer had the John, partly because John, his father, died in 1876, but more importantly,